Greetings, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of the fall series of Wallace Stegner Center Green Bags for the fall of 2020. I'm Bob Kiter, Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and we're very pleased to have you join us today. While we regret that due to the COVID pandemic, we can't gather in person for our fall Green Bag series, we're grateful that our series can be held virtually, and we truly appreciate you joining us via Zoom. Before turning to today's program, just a couple of notes about future Stegner Center Green Bags this fall. We hope you'll join us. Information about the Green Bags, upcoming Green Bags, is available on the Stegner Center website under our calendar of events. On October 15th, we'll be joined by Robert Bonney, former Assistant Secretary in the Department of Agriculture, and in that capacity, he oversaw the Forest Service during the Obama administration. He's currently at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. He will be addressing bridging the rural-urban divide on the environment, a topic that's certainly timely today. And then another timely topic, on October 29th, we will be joined by Paul Van Dam, former Attorney General for the state of Utah, currently a board member for Conserve Southwest Utah. He will be addressing two important topics in southwestern Utah and Washington County, one being the Lake Powell Pipeline and the other being the Northern Corridor Highway extension. He asks the question and will answer, do we need them? So those are our two upcoming Green Bags, and again, information about them is available online under the calendar of events on the Wallace Stegner Center website at the College of Law. Now it's my pleasure, truly my great pleasure, to introduce a colleague who works with us at the Wallace Stegner Center as a Wallace Stegner Center Fellow. She is also an assistant professor for research of law here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And she also holds an appointment as an associate faculty member at the Center for American Indian Health at Johns Hopkins University. And that is Heather Tanana, who is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. She's a graduate of the S.J. Quinney College of Law and also holds a Master's of Public Health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's experienced in state, federal, and tribal courts and has clerked for Judge Nuffer at the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah. She's an active member and founder of the Indian Law Section for the Utah State Bar Association, and she currently chairs the Indian Child Welfare Committee. As part of that committee, Heather led the formation of the Utah Tribal COVID-19 relief effort to provide assistance to Utah's tribal communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. I should add, during the early days of that, and it continues. She also serves as vice chair on the board of the Urban Indian Center of Salt Lake here in town. She joined the Stegner Center in 2019. Her research interests include an overlay between environmental and health policy, promoting better practices in Indian child welfare, and American Indian health. With that, it's appropriate certainly today that Heather's topic is COVID-19 and its impact in Indian country. With that introduction, I will turn the screen over to Heather. Again, thank you all for joining us. There will be an opportunity through the Q&A function to ask questions that we'll address at the end of Heather's presentation. Heather, thank you for delivering this very timely presentation today.
Thank you, Bob. I am so excited to kick off the Green Bag series, and particularly to be talking about today's topic. It's one that is certainly of a professional interest of mine. It raises issues of public health, Indian law, federal policy, lots of different types of inequities and environmental justice. But it's also a very personal issue to me as well. Nishle, I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. My mother is white. On my father's side, I am Kia'ani. That's a towering house, born for Sinajini, the Blackstreak Woods people. And so the history of Native people in this country, the pandemic and the impact that it's had in tribal communities, it's directly affected myself and my family. So to get us started, when we talk about COVID-19 in Indian country, I think a lot of us have seen numbers in the media, on the news portrayed, and I suspect that most of us are aware that some tribes in particular have been hit very hard with shocking numbers. These 10,000 cases here on Navajo Nation. This is a little outdated. We have a little updated number. I think they're at about 10,000 and like 160, a few more confirmed deaths. The rapid rise in cases was getting to the point where it was no longer a question of if someone you knew would contract coronavirus, but it was instead a question of when someone you knew was going to pass away from COVID-19. And so I would be surprised if, colleagues, friends, family, someone they can name personally someone who has passed away from COVID-19. But it's not just Navajo that's been impacted. Other tribes, such as these numbers here, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw, also right now is one of the highest rates in the country. Some of our Pueblo tribes in New Mexico, White Mountain Apache as well. A lot of tribal communities are getting very high infection rates, and as we'll discuss a little later, because of unique conditions in tribal communities, they're having a hard time recovering, facing higher mortality rates, really concerning. And so it leads to the question of why. Why is this happening to Native people in our country? And to answer that question, you really have to look to the past. You have to have an understanding of the way that Native American people in this country have been treated in the history. And so I'm going to spend a little time initially going through the treatment and that history of tribes and Native people in the US. And just a basic refresher here, right? When we started out with the Articles of Confederation in the US, the states had the primary authority, right? And something that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of or they don't think about is that indigenous people, tribal nations, right? They were already here before the US was formally formed. And so they predate the Constitution. And when the Constitution was enacted, it included provisions that continued a government-to-government relationship with the US and with tribal nations. And so we have the Indian Commerce Clause, right? Started to develop these concepts like federal plenary power, that Congress and only Congress is able to legislate about tribal nations and Native people in this country. And then our legal establishment, the principles of federal Indian law, those are rooted in what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. So, or the Marshall Trilogy is the term you'll often hear, right? So the Chief Justice at the time, Justice Marshall, there's a series of 3 cases, and again, they set the basis for how tribal governments are treated today, this relationship between federal, state, tribal entities. And it all came down to a principle that tribes and their people, they were discovered in this country. They were not conquered. And because they were discovered, they retained some inherent sovereign powers, right? If they had been conquered, then they would have lost that kind of sovereignty. But instead, because they were discovered, we have some concept of sovereignty. But then as the cases went on, these were again 3 cases, we also get other terms like domestic dependent nations. So tribes, they have this inherent sovereignty, and yet at the same time, they are dependent upon the federal government. And again, another key principle rises, the trust relationship. We'll hear the federal government and tribes being referred to something similar like a ward and its guardian, trustee, trustor relationships. Those cases really establish the basis of federal Indian law and what we see today. And even when the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed later, right, to apply many of the Bill of Rights to tribes, not all of them were made applicable to tribes. And part of that was, again, because of this unique status that tribes hold. Like, for example, the separation of church and state does not apply to tribes, because there are some tribes where they have a very cultural religious component that's part of like their governmental makeup. So moving on to the next one, again, always a little surprised by how little the average American knows about the treatment and the history of American Indians, Alaska Natives. It's not something that is commonly taught in schools. But if we were to look at our federal Indian policies, these different eras that have been identified, I think it gives us a good summary of what's happened in this country. So starting off, right, again, very early on, we had our Doctrine of Discovery, and then the government was making treaties with tribes, giving certain promises in the treaties to be able to move tribes into a specified location, right? A theme we're going to see across these eras is that the federal government really wants the land base that tribes are situated on. And so a promise is made for them to move off of their land base. And then we discover, well, oops, we want that land too. So we're going to move the tribes again. So this has been really challenging for tribal communities because of the connection that many Native people have to the land, the cultural, traditional significance that it has. But anyway, we'll kind of come back to that, right? So Indian removal era, again, we're going to relocate tribes. Reservation area, we're not just going to relocate them, we're going to stick them on specific confined land bases. Allotment and assimilation, we're going to divide up that land now and give it to individual Indians. And all of these policies resulted in actions that have permanent consequences today, right? If you hear the term a checkerboard reservation, that comes straight from these allotment and assimilation era. Because once the land was divided up and became kind of what would say is fee land, right, for an individual Native American, then that land could then be sold, and it went often into the hands of a non-Native. And now all of a sudden we have kind of like Native land, non-Native, and it can create really complicated jurisdictional issues. But so we talked about kind of this theme of land grabs. The second theme we see throughout these policies is that they're made with the intent of trying to assimilate Native people into the dominant white culture. if we turn them into farmers, if we make Native people Christians, then surely they will succeed in society. Surprise to surprise, that did not end up happening. And in fact, after many of these eras, the conditions that Native people faced were often much worse. Now, Indian Reorganization Era, I think is really interesting because it's one that again was well-intended to have tribal governments be formally established. The federal government encouraged tribal nations to adopt constitutions of their own. And, again, it seems well-intended, but the problem, I think, with that era is that it was trying to force an American white model on these Native Indigenous communities that for their people may not have fit very well. So still very much a paternalistic view towards tribes. And then there's, very much a flip-flop in the government's position with the termination and relocation era. Over 100 tribes lost their status as being federally recognized. When that happens, right, they would lose all sorts of access to different benefits. Again, not many people know that many tribal members were relocated into urban areas at that time, losing the connection to their land and their community, and trying to establish themselves in a completely new city. It's very challenging. And then moving on to our last era here, Indian self-determination era, started about the 70s and were viewed as still being in that era. This is finally for the first time that we have the federal government trying to empower tribal nations and allowing them to exercise these governmental authorities in the way that they think is best appropriate for their community, given their people, their culture, their values. So that's where a brief run through of the different eras. And what I really want you to take away from this is that many of these eras, some were not well intended, I don't think, right? Kind of terminating tribal nations. It didn't have any focus on what they thought the government thought was best for tribes, but some of them did have good intentions behind them, right? The federal government wanted tribes to succeed, but the way that they tried to accomplish that goal was in a method that a white American system thought was best, and not one that considered the tribal perspective or what might be appropriate for these tribal communities. And as a result, we end up with what many have written about historical trauma, that these past events that our ancestors have gone through have lasting effects on people still alive today. And some examples here, right, are the forced relocation. The two most common relocations you'll hear about are the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk that the Cherokees and the Navajo Nation went through. But all of these different areas are very common to many tribes. There are many, many other tribes that had to endure similar acts by the federal government where they were forcibly removed, required to walk hundreds of miles to a new location and leave just everything behind them. Come back to boarding schools, but sterilization, right? Many Native women, this is not that long ago, were being sterilized by the Indian Health Service without their knowledge or consent. It was very harming to Navajo people when there was a forced livestock reduction. They were required, the government came through and killed many of their sheep, something that is very connected to Navajo way of life. And the uranium mining, I'm not sure if anyone saw, I think this was in the last year, New Mexico did a study down on Navajo and found that Navajo babies being born today have traces of uranium in their blood. And so mines that supposedly were closed long ago and cleaned up are continuing to contaminate the land and to poison our people, right? So these actions, these past actions, still have serious consequences and impact today. And many of these, I encourage you, you can read about them. You can Google them and learn about them. And I definitely encourage you to do that. But I also encourage you to listen. When you have the opportunity to talk with an Indigenous person here, all of these are themes that many of us have experienced. And so I will often share my story, which is really not my story, it's my dad's story, that he went through the boarding school era. And yet it wasn't me that was taken away from my parents, and yet I still feel his experience very personally. When he was young, he grew up, had never seen a white person. He grew up very traditionally, hadn't heard a word of English, lived in a hogan, and one day a white man showed up at their house and just whisked him away. And it wasn't explained to them where he was going. It wasn't explained to my grandmother when he would be coming back, if he would be coming back. And the intent at the time, right, was something I think many of us would agree with, was a good goal to educate Native children, right? Isn't education a good thing? I think most would agree with that. But the way that the federal government went about it resulted in much greater harm than was necessary, and harm that continues today. When my father showed up at the boarding school, all the children, their hair was cut. And having been raised very traditionally, that had meaning to it. And it was severing the ties to his culture. And I think he viewed to his family. And when he was caught speaking Navajo, he was whipped. What a scary experience for a young child to not know a language and to be punished for doing anything that connected you back to what you knew and what you viewed as your home. And so one night, he and another little boy decided to run away. They're going to go back home. And it was winter time and very cold. And he said, they made it quite a ways away before they could stop feeling their toes. And it was so cold, they couldn't walk anymore. And he said he remembered laying there in a field feeling like, this is it, I'm gonna die. And it was only because a rancher came across and found him and this other boy that he was returned to the school and did not freeze to death. And again, you can see I get very emotional. I didn't go through that, but because my father did, it has a lasting impact on all of myself and all of my siblings. And it has affected the way that we view the world around us. Now, I'll tell you, my father went on to be one of the first people to go to college. He became a medical physician and has dedicated his entire career to the healthcare of Native people. Again, something that many of us would applaud and say, you've reached the pinnacle of American success. And what always bothers me when I share that story is when someone says to me, well, Heather, wasn't it good that your father went through that experience? Otherwise, he might not have become a doctor. I think, what I'd like, and again, encourage us to think about, is when we're faced with a problem, we need to understand all of the different factors that go into it. Yes, it was great my father became a physician. It was great that he got an education, but did we have to go about it the way that we did? Did we have to experience the traumas that we did? And I think the answer is no. I think there would have been a better way of consulting with the tribal community and coming up with a solution that was accepted by and had the support of that tribal community. And we could have educated Native children without resulting in these long-term harms. So I just share that with you because, again, you can read about these, but sometimes it's hard to truly grasp and understand the issue. So, got a Kleenex. So let's talk about where we are today. All right, the landscape has really changed. We have a nice little picture there of the US and Utah specifically where we're at. And like to acknowledge, right, the University of Utah and where I'm speaking from today, right, we sit on the traditional cultural lands of many tribes that are still present in Utah: Shoshone, Goshute, Utes, and Paiutes. That's historically their lands here. And if we look at the map on the right, their land base has shrunk considerably, right, based upon acts from the federal government. What's highlighted in orange there are the tribal lands that remain today. And the challenge of this change in landscape has been that even though the tribal lands have been reduced in size, that doesn't mean that the tribe no longer has a cultural or tradition or religious connection to their historic lands, right? I think something that really illustrated that well is when we looked at the case of, right, the Tennessee Valley Authority area. I think it was 21 tribes have some significant connection to the Tennessee Valley. And when again, big Endangered Species Act case, right, TBA versus Hill, environmentalists, we really applauded that decision. The snail darters were saved, the dam was prevented from, an injunction being put into place. Not many people are aware that at about the same time, there was another case going on that had been initiated by the Eastern Band of Cherokees, because they asserted that even though their land was no longer in that area, they had historic and cultural ties to the area. And so it can be, anyway, to take from that case, it was dismissed, right? And the tribal interests were not protected because they no longer were directly holding on to any kind of interest in that land legally, but culturally and traditionally they still did. So the eras have made it more challenging for tribes to protect cultural significant sites that are no longer within the boundaries of their reservation, but those ties still exist. Real quick, based on, right, all of these things that I've kind of run through, the different federal policy eras, the relocations, termination of recognition, really the treatment and history of Native Americans in these countries has resulted in really dire conditions on the reservation or in Indian country, right? And you can pull up, I think this is just last year, 2019, US Civil Rights Commission did a report that focused on the various broken promises of the federal government. And this is like a little snapshot here. And these ones all relate to the pandemic and have kind of fueled the fire of what's happened in Indian country. Top one, limited health resources. So the Indian Health Service is the primary agency responsible for providing health care to Native people in this country. IHS has been chronically underfunded, right? Another report says to fully fund IHS, you would need $32 billion. So when we look at the CARES Act packages that have been passed, a lot of people say, oh my gosh, Navajo got $700 million, right? Won't that fix the problem? That's like putting a little Band-Aid on a big gash or an amputation, right? Yes, it will help us make some progress, but the deficits we were dealing with before the pandemic went in place are still there, and they've been built on top of each other. So real challenge there. Food deserts. All right, there are not a lot of grocery stores on the Navajo Reservation. It's a challenge to get fresh vegetables and fruits. Water insecurity, there's some different, the data behind this is a little tricky, hasn't been fully explored, but two different percentages that have been thrown out there by IHS and Navajo Utility Authority is that 30 or 40% of homes on Navajo Nation lack water access, right? We also are encountering housing shortages. Yes, there is some kind of cultural component to families living together, right? Grandmothers play a huge important role in Navajo society of passing down and teaching traditions. But aside from that, you know, there are not enough homes for people to reside in. We get multiple families living together. I don't know who's driven down past Moab, past Blanding lately, past Montezuma Creek and Monument Valley, and tried to take a phone call lately, right? If you've been on some webinars, a lot of our tribal leaders or people from tribal communities who are participating, they often cannot have a video capability because they don't have the broadband down there to support it. So they're calling in. And even when they call in, sometimes it's a little unreliable. And then there are rules where the federal government, different agencies, even states have put these in place sometimes about having to consult with tribes. We're seeing that even though it's in paper, in reality, it's not really meaningful or effective consultation to try and work on some of these issues. So it's not surprising, right? If you don't have water and you can't frequently wash your hands, if there are limited grocery stores where you can't stock up on food to quarantine or isolate for long periods of time, that it might be hard to take the necessary precautions against COVID-19. And that's what we saw. This is the report from CDC that came out in late August, right? And these were their three main takeaways. American Indians, Alaska Natives appear to be disproportionately affected. They tried to do a survey of all 50 states, ran into data issues. And so in the 23 states that had adequate data, it confirmed that the rate was 3.5 times higher for Native people. And then the report highlighted, right? We need adequate healthcare and public health infrastructure to be able to respond to the pandemic and to address this. So it kind of confirmed what everyone had been thinking. So how do we deal with the pandemic, right? My last few minutes here, just wanted to throw this up so those who aren't familiar with Indian law, right? It's not, yes, we have some collaboration by states, but this really isn't a state issue. Right. If we go back to the Marshall Trilogy cases, there's very strong language in there that the states have absolutely no authority in Indian country or with anything with respect to tribes. That's kind of changed a little bit over time. We're seeing states start to do a little bit of encroachment, particularly with like taxing, but for the most part, right, this is a tribal matter and with a federal one. And so there's been some questions, right? It's not just natives that live on the reservation or in Indian country, there's also non-natives. How can you do an effective response to a pandemic that is enforceable against the entire community, regardless of whether you are Indian or not, right? And so we have some kind of tests here about tribal civil regulation of non-members. And In general, we have some consensual relationships. Think contracts there. Sometimes someone choosing to reside on the Navajo reservation, right? There can be arguments that you consented to their jurisdiction. But the big one, and I think that gets particularly triggered by a pandemic, is this direct effects kind of threats to the tribal welfare. That tribes can exercise jurisdiction when it threatens or has a direct effect on political integrity, economic security, health, or welfare. So that's where a lot of tribes have been pulling from when they're implementing these kind of social distancing mask mandates on their communities. Regardless, tribal sovereignty is very much alive today. Okay? Tribes have that inherent authority to protect their citizens, and they are wielding it regularly. Okay, now I want to, in the last, so that we have time for questions, go over this. How are tribes responding to these other issues? So certainly the health challenges, tribes have been, there's some that are very successful at supplementing health services through their using money from their other enterprises, whether that's energy development, gaming. They will open up their own tribal health clinics. Okay, that helps to some extent, but the resources available and the different economic development by tribes really varies. Okay. Food deserts, we are seeing a push to traditional food programs, right? Kind of our, this nonprofit in Utah, Utah B'nai B'keya, they have started a traditional foods program where we're teaching communities about the traditional harvests and different foods that grow well, and they're given community. So we're seeing a revitalization of traditional knowledges, and that massive pile of tomatoes there, that's actually from my mom's garden in Monument Valley. And I'll say this year she got way more tomatoes than I did up here in Salt Lake. So, you know, there are ways of doing community gardens, home gardens, and we're seeing a push to do that. And just that little map there, right? If you were to Google, so that's Navajo Nation, and there's our 13 grocery stores. And the Goldings one is, that's the one closest to Monument Valley. I'll say it's not much bigger than like a 7-Eleven. So very limited resources, but we're pulling on trying to revitalize traditional knowledges to build community gardens and home gardens. From COVID, there was a work group, COVID funds, there was a work group established with IHS and Navajo Nation to address the water insecurity issue. Right, so big thing, if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, it's that attention has been brought to these issues and that money is finally being allocated to try and address it. I don't think it's enough money, but again, at least it's a start. So the work group, you can go to it. I'd really encourage you, check out their website. It's got a lot of really interesting information, but they have tried to map out homes without piped water. They're putting in water access points, some really good work here. And something else I want to highlight is that, you know, we need, if you're in the water world, you're probably familiar that there are water settlements that tribes are involved with. So when reservations were set aside, a series of cases, right, Winter's Doctrine, said that when Congress set aside those lands, they also included enough water for the purpose of the reservation. So tribes need and are entitled and have a right to water for their reservation. Now, how much water is that? Well, you know, water systems don't operate in isolation. It involves the interests of other local communities, of state interests. And so we end up sometimes in water settlements, right, where tribes will be negotiating, federal government comes in, states come in, and we try to settle out those water rights. Can be cheaper and faster than going through the court system. Now, what we've seen happen with the pandemic is that Navajo Nation wrote a letter to Arizona asking that some water be able, a certain amount, be able to be used and diverted to Winter Rock, right? We need to get water to the community. It's not only a public health issue, right? It's a human rights issue. And Arizona refused. They said, well, unless you waive your water settlement rights, we're not going to agree to that. You need to settle your water rights first. We can't tie the right to water, to be able to drink water, shower, cook, eat, with these political, more complicated issues. So we're seeing, right, it's been raised by Arizona, by other states, and I think with this movement, there's a real opportunity to try and educate politicians, community members, that everyone in this country should have an equal right to water in their homes. I just can't imagine if Navajo, the kind of equivalent would be to say, well, okay, we need to shut off water to Phoenix until our water right is resolved through the settlements, right? I don't know why we are thinking about water for tribal communities. And again, these are non-natives living there as well, but people who are residing on reservations, we are viewing that differently than we would other communities. So wrap up. Sorry, I want to leave a little more time for questions, but the McGirt case, this is a pretty long quote from it, but I really was excited to read this case. And the reason it gives me hope about the future is because we're having our highest court say to the federal government, you made a promise, you're going to have to keep it. And if we look in our treaties of many tribes, there's language about the prosperity of tribal communities. And I think there's a real opportunity to jump off of the McGirt ruling and to work towards getting clean water access, getting infrastructure into all homes on the reservation, because that's a necessary component of prosperity. How can you be healthy? How can you succeed in life? There's economic components to it, unless you have some basic utilities that so many people, the vast majority of people in our country, take for granted every day. So I am optimistic about the future. I think tribes, right? Yes, there are challenges, but Native people were very resilient. And sovereignty is, again, it's being exercised every day. We're making progress. And I think this attention and additional stream of money is helping us get over the first hurdle, and hopefully will kind of open the gate to make real progress, so that the next time we have a pandemic come through, we won't be wondering whether everyone has enough water to drink. All right, I will end there so that we can look at some questions.
Heather, thank you for that very thoughtful and penetrating presentation that gives us a real sense of the challenges confronting Indian country with this pandemic. We have a question about that's tied into international law, but I thought before I went international, I'd just take the moderator's prerogative and ask you, in light of the fact that we have a number of people on the Zoom presentation connected with the Utah State Bar, if you might take a couple minutes and describe the COVID relief effort that the Indian Law Section, largely at your behest, was involved with in providing assistance to tribes in southern Utah and in Navajo country.
Oh yeah, thank you for that question and giving me the opportunity to address it, because even though we had our CARES Act kind of legislation, 3 big acts went out and funds were allocated to tribes, it was a real challenge to actually get that money out to tribes. Tribes were last to get the funding. And then even once it gets to tribes, often they have to pass their own kind of resolutions of how they're going to spend the money. So it took a while, and there's still this gap of people in the community actually getting relief, actually getting food, actually getting water. And so that is where we saw the rise of these kind of nonprofits and third-party groups. And our group, Utah Tribal COVID Relief 19, was formed through the Indian law section of the bar. A lot of people in our ICWA committee, you know, we had relatives or different colleagues who were talking about how their experience was down on the reservation. You know, I know we all encountered the toilet paper issue where you couldn't seem to find it in any stores, right? But that's even worse if you can't find it in any store within a 4-hour drive. So we decided to form our group, and we had various partners, different state agencies, Department of Human Services, Juvenile Justice Services was a big one, and we collected donations, and primarily Navajo being the group community most in need, the vast majority of our donations have gone down to Southern Utah. But again, there's 8 federally recognized tribes in Utah. We don't have any state recognized tribes, but all of them, well, I take that back. Ute has been doing very well, but Ute Indian tribe, I think, has been doing pretty well in their case numbers. They had like 3 or 7 cases out. It wasn't very high. But the other tribes we've also reached out to, and it's turned into an ongoing basis. So if you're interested, we're going to be doing another big drive to make a delivery in December with the Backcountry Santa group, which is pretty neat. These little helicopter backcountry pilots go down. And our website, the Indian Bar section website, has information about that. We could probably put that in the chat.
Thank you. And related to that, we did have a related question asking specifically what things can a person do to help out? Maybe as a lawyer, maybe as a donor, or maybe just in the form of donating time. The questioner noted that they'd made note of the 2 links that you included in your presentation. Any other suggestions or thoughts or connections that might be made?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the Navajo numbers have studied. We're seeing other communities where it's rising, but everyone is anticipating the surge again, right, in the fall and winter of cases. So I think in terms of people who are able to donate funds or money, there's just such a need. You know, our tribal communities, particularly down in Monument Valley, they rely very heavily on the tourism. In the summer, they get busloads of people from Europe, all over the world, and that's where they will get their money for the year. And because of the pandemic, the tribal park was closed, and, you know, there was curfews in, so you couldn't even get in on the weekends unless you lived down there. And so a lot of people lost big streams of income. And so I'd say the donations, there's food donations. I mean, it just goes to so many things. Those are much in need. In the winter, even on a good year, people need firewood. And so whether it's, you know, I think there's a lot of good groups out there. Certainly our Utah Tribal COVID, right, is one option, but there are many options that you can go to. The Ethel Branch was the former Navajo Attorney General. She's been heading up the Hopi, I want to say Hopi Dene or Dene Hopi COVID relief group as well. I think, I don't want to get political, but from my family members down on the res, what I hear is that these kind of nonprofit groups are often very good at connecting to the local community and getting things out to those who need it. That said, Navajo Nation and a lot of the tribes, they have their own separate funds that you can directly donate to them as well.
Okay. Well, it occurs to me that perhaps we could add a couple of websites with some direction on the Stegner Center website following your presentation, and that would be available if people are interested.
Mhm.
So we can follow up with that after today. You have another question, and that is how does United States policy directed toward tribal and indigenous cultural attachments to the land, even without, with or without legal title to the property, relate to international law regarding cultural property and cultural rights? Are you comfortable responding to the international dimensions of this issue?
You know, so I think there's some scholarship out there that will kind of do comparisons, but I haven't written about it. But I will say that international law principles are not part of our federal Indian law scheme. And when we try and look at things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? The US isn't part of that. So there certainly is some push, I think, for people to kind of refer to other areas of international law as for argument's sake, but when we talk about what's enforceable, it's just not part of our legal scheme. I'm trying to think. Yeah. I mean, because again, it's really interesting to compare the TVA case with that Sequoia one. And maybe I'll try and put that link up there too, because there's a little blog article. And the TVA case, the Supreme Court, they made a note that some Cherokees tribes had a historic connection to the land, but it was like a one-liner. And so we're just not seeing real enforceable rights, and the whole way the land is held is a little different.
Okay, thank you. And with that, let me bring things to a close today. Join me in thanking Heather, at least virtually. I'll do it with a little clap here. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation, very timely. And let me remind everyone that we will be back online via Zoom on October 15th with another green bag, Bridging the Rural-Urban Divide on the Environment. Robert Bonney, former Obama administration official overseeing the Forest Service, will speak. He's currently at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. So we look forward to seeing you, and thank you again for being with us today. Have a good afternoon.